Two women walk through the gardens of Versailles on a sunny afternoon, but as they pass beneath a shaded grove, something changes. The air stills, the light dims, and their worlds are turned upside down. This is the true story of the Versailles time slip, a moment that defies history and refuses explanation. Welcome back to Legends May Live, where we explore the strange, the mysterious, and the downright eerie. Today we're going all the way back to 1901 and beyond, to the Versailles time slip. It was meant to be a holiday, a hard-earned getaway for two academics. The well-respected scholars, Charlotte and Moberly, and Eleanor Jourdain, arrived in Paris on a summer afternoon in 1901. They weren't thrill-seekers or ghost hunters. They weren't looking for mystery or anything of that nature. If anything, their pursuits were in the measurable and verifiable. They pursued knowledge above all. Moberly was the principal of St. Hugh's College in Oxford. She had a brilliant mind. She was the daughter of a bishop, and her upbringing was in the halls of logic and discipline. Jourdain was vice principal. She was an educator with a deep love for French history and culture. She was preparing to relocate to Paris. Moberly had joined her for a brief tour of the city before her move. They shared a passion for knowledge and an admiration for Marie Antoinette. So when the weekend offered them free time, they were excited to take the opportunity to visit Versailles, which had served as the center of the French court and government from 1682 until the French Revolution. On August 10th, 1901, the sun was high and the air was thick with the stillness of a European summer as the women arrived. They stepped off of their train and walked up the promenade. Though everything was beautiful and fascinating with towering walls and carefully sculpted artwork, it wasn't the palace that interested them. What really drew their attention was the Petit Trianon, the private retreat of Queen Marie Antoinette. It was a hidden estate nestled in the gardens, just this quiet, intimate, beautiful smaller place, which was built in 1768. As the ladies walked along, admiring the garden and the hedgework, they're following along the map, but they make a wrong turn somewhere. Then they try to get their bearings, but they realize the path that they're on isn't one that's listed on the map. Curiosity captivated the two, so they kept walking. Then they came to a footbridge that seemed very old-fashioned, even for 1901. The rest of the estate was well-maintained and kept up with the highest quality modern standards. So this did seem odd, but they were off the map path, so they thought maybe this was just an unused part of the estate that they really don't put as much attention to. But as they began to walk across the bridge, they got this weird feeling about halfway through. Just the atmosphere changed. It was something subtle, but undeniable. Jourdain would later describe it like this. Everything suddenly looked unnatural. The trees seemed flat, like a backdrop. Even the sunlight felt wrong, lifeless, as if we walked out of the world we knew and into something staged. They pressed on, following what they thought was the correct route back to the Petit Trianon, but nothing was familiar. They passed two men sitting in the shade near an old-fashioned building, like something from the 18th century. The men were dressed in gray-green coats with tricorn hats and long cloaks. They seemed almost frozen in space. They didn't move or speak, and the whole scene just seemed out of place. Jourdain thought they looked like palace gardeners, but odd, not like any she had seen. They looked almost like hyper-realistic wax figures. Both women felt like these men were just watching them, just judging them like they were the ones that didn't belong. Then, just toward the edge of the path, a man walks up. He stood beneath the trees. He was cloaked and his hat was pulled low. But what they could see of his face was that it was pale and covered with pockmarked skin, and he had this sort of hollow, emotionless expression. He turned and looked at them. He was just sort of watching as they moved, before finally gesturing to them to indicate which path to take. Moberly would later write that this moment felt sinister, as if the air itself had shifted around them, just weighted and charged. Yet still, they felt somehow compelled to follow this man's direction. They tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to them. They were in the gardens of Versailles, and yet they weren't. Something had changed. And the deeper they walked, the stranger it would get. As they looked at the gardens of Versailles stretched out around them, something was wrong. The colors had dulled. The air was heavier now, and still, unnaturally so. Charlotte Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain anxiously and cautiously continued their walk toward the Petit Trianon, or at least where they believed it must be. They followed a winding path that came upon an old farmhouse. As they walked, Jourdain, who was walking slightly behind, they continued glancing at the trees and hedges, trying to make sense of this odd, distorted color. When she looked up, she noticed that Moberly had drifted ahead or taken a turn without saying anything. She didn't see Moberly, so she just walked the way she thought that she must have gone. Quickly realizing that they must have taken different paths, Jourdain continued on, just thinking that they would find each other at the Petit Trianon. But as she pressed on, she veered slightly off path. She approached a small cottage-like building with shutters. It was old and run down, with a single window cracked open. Through the window, she noticed movement. Then a woman appeared at the window. Her face was pale and her expression empty, much like the cloaked man from earlier. She was holding this white cloth and methodically, rhythmically shaking it out in the air. Jourdain would later describe the woman's movements as mechanical and unfeeling. Like the path she was on, this building wasn't on any map of the gardens. Meanwhile, Moberly found herself walking a slightly different route, and what she saw would stay with her for the rest of her life. Just off the path, beside a low stone wall, a woman sat alone on a stool. She wore an old-fashioned dress, pale green and voluminous. Her hair was styled up in the way of the late 1700s. She was just quietly and calmly sketching something. But her features were sort of strange. They were unnaturally smooth, almost wax-like. And she never looked up, not once. Moberly didn't stop to speak, but something about the woman unnerved her. It wasn't just the clothing, it was the way she had existed in the scene, as if she didn't belong to their world. Later, when Moberly saw portraits of Marie Antoinette, she felt sick. She was certain that that woman had been the queen. Jourdain emerged from around the corner of the hedges, and the two women gave a sigh of relief to be reunited. Then suddenly, from behind, a young man approached. He was dressed plainly, no cloak, no tricorn hat. He spoke with a warm, modern Parisian accent. He could see that they were uncomfortable and confused, so he asked if they were lost, and then it was as if a spell broke. He guided them along a small lane, one they hadn't noticed before, and pointed them toward the Petit Trianon, and just like that, the colors returned. The air lifted. The world felt real again. They finished the rest of the visit without incident, but neither woman spoke about the encounter. Not at first. After their tour, they hopped back on the train and headed home. Back in England, life returned to normal. The lectures, the papers, the structure of academia continued as usual. But the memory of that garden lingered. The feeling of walking through a dream. The hollow-eyed men, the woman in the cloth, the queen. It was weeks before they finally spoke about it. But one afternoon, Eleanor Jourdain sat down and wrote everything she remembered about that strange day in Versailles. Without telling her, Charlotte Moberly did the same. Eventually, in passing, one of the women mentioned that they had written their account down, and when realizing they had both done the same thing, they rushed to compare notes, and what they found shook them both. They had both seen the same people. They had both described the same stillness in the air, the same path that didn't appear on any maps, and the same oppressive feeling like walking through a painting or a memory. But there was more. Moberly hadn't known what Jourdain had seen. Jourdain hadn't known about the woman sketching. Yet their stories aligned in ways that were too precise to ignore. That's when the research began. They pored over maps, records, and paintings of the palace grounds, especially the Petit Trianon. Several of the buildings, they recalled, didn't exist in 1901, but they had existed in the 18th century. They found drawings of the exact footbridge, but it was impossible that this is the one that they saw because it was removed during the early 1800s. They identified the cloaked man as resembling the Comte de Vaudreuil, a known figure in Marie Antoinette's inner circle, and the woman at the window shaking a cloth. It matched the description of a maid who had tended to the Queen's quarters right before her arrest. Then came the final detail. The date that they had wandered through Versailles, August 10th. In 1792, on that very date, Marie Antoinette had been seized by the revolutionaries, dragged from the palace, imprisoned, and condemned. Had they stumbled into some kind of emotional imprint? Had the garden remembered? Or had time thinned just enough for them to pass through? In 1911, a decade after their strange journey, the women published their findings in a book called An Adventure, but under pseudonyms. They knew the risks. They were women, academics, in a society where credibility was everything. To say that you had walked through time, it wasn't just unusual, it was career suicide. But they stood by every word, and they never backed down. When An Adventure was published in 1911, it caused a stir. Written under the names Elizabeth Morrison and Frances Lemon, the book didn't reveal its authors' true identities until years later. At first, it was treated like a curiosity, sort of like an old, odd ghost story from a pair of anonymous travelers. But once people learned who had written it, that changed everything. Two highly respected academics from Oxford claiming that they had walked through a ripple in time. It wasn't just scandalous, it was dangerous. Critics dismissed it as fantasy. They called it a shared delusion at best. One reviewer called it a charming exercise in self-deception. Others labeled it spiritualism, wishful thinking, or even Victorian hysteria. But the details wouldn't go away. Their descriptions of the palace grounds, the clothing, the placement of paths, buildings, and people, many of those elements weren't public knowledge in 1901. Some of them wouldn't be rediscovered until after the book's publication. They hadn't just imagined Versailles. They had described a version of it that no longer existed. So what really happened? Some say it was a time slip, a moment where the veil between centuries thinned. Others suggested a residual haunting, an echo of August 10th, 1792, replaying like a recording, burned into the grounds of Versailles. There are others who say it was a shared psychic experience, shaped by suggestion, stress, or even heat stroke. And of course, some believe it was an elaborate hoax. But that raises a question. What did they have to gain? They made no money, they didn't seek fame. If anything, they risked their reputations, and for a decade they stayed silent, so why publish it at all? Maybe because they believed that what they saw mattered. That they had witnessed something real, something important, and something that shouldn't be forgotten. Charlotte Ann Moberly died in 1937. Eleanor Jourdain in 1924. Neither ever retracted a word. The gardens of Versailles have seen revolution, bloodshed, betrayal, and beauty. They've stood still while the world around them changed. And maybe, on just the right day, for just the right people, time itself forgets to move forward. Maybe it folds. Maybe it turns back. And maybe, just maybe, two scholars didn't imagine the past. They walked through it. Thanks for joining me on Legends May Live. If you enjoyed today's episode, please remember to like, subscribe, and send it to a friend who loves the strange and mysterious. Until next time, keep your eyes open, because you never know when you might be somewhere you shouldn't be.